Have you ever felt that something was watching you? Not someone, but something, patiently waiting for you to notice it. It all began with a decision. My family had planned a trip to visit my grandmother's sister, a woman I had only met a few times. Her house, however, was far more famous, or rather infamous. Tales of its eerie presence, whispers in the walls, and piano melodies playing themselves at night had circulated among the family for years. The journey there was isolating. The road twisted and turned through dense woods, the trees forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the sunlight. Shadows stretched long across the road as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting a dim, golden light through the car windows. My cousin Emma, who was sitting next to me in the back seat, fidgeted nervously. Usually, she couldn't go 5 minutes without talking, but now she was unusually quiet. "This place already feels creepy, and we're not even there yet," she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's just a house," I said, though my own unease was growing with every mile we drove. When we arrived, the sight of the house took my breath away, not in awe, but in dread. The house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, towering against the dim twilight sky. Its silhouette was dark and imposing, its pointed roof and tall, narrow windows giving it an almost predatory appearance. Ivy crawled up its sides, and the wood of the exterior was weathered and cracked. The air felt colder here, not the natural chill of an autumn evening, but something sharper, something that seemed to seep into your skin. As we stepped out of the car, the gravel crunched beneath our feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent night. Standing on the front porch was my grandmother's sister. She was a small woman with sharp features and silver hair tied back neatly. Her piercing eyes scanned us as though she were assessing whether we were worthy of stepping into her home. "Welcome," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made me uneasy. "Come inside. The night air here isn't kind." Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into another world. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and carried a faint scent of lavender mixed with something metallic and old. Heavy curtains covered the windows, casting the house in shadows that seemed to move on their own. The hallway stretched long and narrow, illuminated only by a flickering chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with portraits, their subjects staring down at us with expressions that ranged from stern to sorrowful. One painting, larger than the others, immediately caught my attention. It depicted a young woman in a flowing white dress, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of ink. She held a single red rose, her eyes, hollow and piercing, seeming to meet mine no matter where I stood. "Who is she?" I asked, unable to tear my gaze away. "That's Margaret," my grandmother's sister replied. "She belonged to the house." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The room I was assigned was small and sparsely furnished. An iron-framed bed sat in the center, its mattress thin and uninviting. A wardrobe loomed in the corner, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness that felt unnaturally deep. On the bedside table sat a small book. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the title, embossed in faded gold letters, read, "Whispers of the Forgotten." Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the book. Its pages were blank, but as I flipped through them, I noticed faint impressions, like words that had been erased but left ghostly traces behind. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The house felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper of the wind against the windows seemed deliberate, as though the house were testing us. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my door. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first, but as I lay there holding my breath, they grew louder, more deliberate. Finally, summoning what courage I could muster, I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, the faint light from the chandelier casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were vivid and unsettling. I found myself standing in the parlor, the grand piano playing softly by itself. The melody was haunting, each note resonating with an unspoken sadness that seemed to echo through the house. Seated at the piano was the woman from the portrait. Her pale hands moved gracefully over the keys, her dark hair framing her face. As the music swelled, she turned to look at me, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with despair. I woke with a start, my heart racing. The room was freezing, the air so cold I could see my breath hanging in the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Unable to shake the dream, I ventured downstairs. The parlor was silent, but the piano stood as if waiting for someone to play it. Its polished surface reflected the faint light of the moon, and for a moment, I swore I saw a shadow pass across its keys. I stepped closer, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. As I reached out to touch the piano, the air around me grew heavy, and a faint whisper brushed past my ear. "Leave," it said. My hand froze midair, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. If this story has you hooked, give it a like and share it with someone who loves a good scare. Stay with me for the next chilling chapter. The sunlight streaming through the thick curtains felt weak and distant, as though it too hesitated to touch the house. I woke with a start, the vivid remnants of my nightmare clinging to my mind like a dark fog. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to shake off the memory of Margaret's hollow eyes and the chilling sound of her voice. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, its hands creeping toward 7 a.m. I wanted to dismiss the dream as just that, a dream, but the weight in my chest told me otherwise. Something about this house wasn't right. Downstairs, the dining room was bathed in a pale, muted light that did little to warm the cold atmosphere. My grandmother's sister had set the table, the spread of fresh bread, tea, and jam looking almost too perfect, as if it were a distraction from the house itself. Emma sat across from me, her face pale and her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. Before I could answer, my father cut in. "Old houses make noise," he said sharply, his tone dismissive. "It's nothing to worry about." But Emma wasn't convinced, and neither was I. The tension in the room was palpable, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were all pretending everything was fine. My grandmother's sister remained silent, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a cup of tea. After breakfast, I decided to explore the house further. The morning light, though weak, made the hallways feel less oppressive, but the shadows in the corners still seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I wandered into a room I hadn't noticed the day before, a library filled with towering bookshelves that stretched all the way to the ceiling. The air inside was musty, carrying the scent of old paper and aged wood. As I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, one in particular caught my attention. Its cover was dark green, embossed with gold lettering that had faded over time. The title read, "Echoes of the Forgotten." Opening it, I found pages filled with handwritten notes and illustrations. The drawings depicted the house in various states of disrepair, surrounded by swirling shadows and faint, ghostly figures. One page in particular made my stomach drop. It was a sketch of Margaret, her hollow eyes staring out from the page. My exploration eventually led me back to the second floor, where the locked door stood waiting at the end of the hallway. The engraving above it, "Let the Forgotten Rest," felt more like a warning than a simple inscription. I tried the handle again, but it wouldn't budge. Pressing my ear against the wood, I thought I heard something faint, like the distant sound of a piano melody, soft and haunting. "What are you doing?" The voice startled me, and I turned to see my grandmother's sister standing at the other end of the hallway. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone carried a sharp edge. "That door stays locked for a reason," she said firmly, her voice echoing in the empty corridor. "You'd do well to leave it alone." The dream that night. That night I dreamed again, but this time it felt more real. Too real. I was standing in the hallway, facing the locked door. It was ajar now, the faint light spilling out into the darkness like a beacon. As I stepped closer, the cold air grew sharper, biting into my skin. Pushing the door open, I found myself in a small circular room. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and in the center of the room stood a single chair. Margaret sat in it, her red rose clutched tightly in her pale hands. "You have to help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, the floor beneath me began to crack and crumble, and I was falling into a dark abyss. I woke, drenched in sweat, the sound of her voice still echoing in my ears. The attic, uncovering secrets. Unable to sleep, I ventured into the attic with a flashlight. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder the higher I climbed. The attic was filled with forgotten relics, dusty trunks, broken furniture, and old photographs scattered across the floor. As I sifted through the items, I found a small, locked chest. The lock was rusted, and with some effort, I managed to break it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in an elegant hand. Each letter was addressed to Margaret. As I read through them, a chilling narrative began to emerge. "Margaret, the house is alive. It feeds on us, growing stronger with every moment we stay. Please, don't let it take you." Confronting my grandmother's sister. The next morning I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Clutching the letters, I confronted my grandmother's sister in the kitchen. "Who wrote these?" I demanded, holding up the papers. "What is this house?" Her face paled, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then with a heavy sigh, she motioned for me to sit. "This house," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not just a building, it's a presence, a thing that watches and waits." Margaret knew that, but she didn't listen. And now... Her voice broke, and she turned away, leaving me with more questions than answers. What do you think of Margaret's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's unravel the mystery together. The morning arrived hesitantly, as though the sun itself feared touching the cursed house. Weak rays of light seeped through the heavy curtains, casting long, distorted shadows on the creaking wooden floors. I woke with a start, my body drenched in cold sweat. The nightmare still clung to me, vivid and unrelenting. Margaret's hollow eyes, her whispered plea, the darkness that seemed to consume everything. The air in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, and carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. As I sat up, I became aware of the faintest sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. They were slow and deliberate, each creak of the floorboards louder than the last. Downstairs, the dining room was cloaked in an oppressive silence. The table was set perfectly, but the sight of fresh bread, jam, and tea did nothing to ease the tension hanging in the air. Emma sat across from me, her face pale and her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She held her teacup tightly, her knuckles white, as though the act of holding something tangible grounded her. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, my father cut in, his tone sharp and dismissive. "This is nonsense. It's just an old house. Wind, creaking wood. That's all it is." Emma didn't look convinced, and neither was I. Her eyes met mine, silently pleading for validation. I nodded slightly, just enough for her to see, and her shoulders relaxed, if only a little. My grandmother's sister sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She avoided everyone's gaze, her expression distant and unreadable. The unease from breakfast lingered long after the meal was over. The heavy air in the house seemed to press down on me, urging me to keep moving, to keep searching for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I wandered aimlessly through the hallways, each one feeling longer and darker than it had the day before. The faint scent of lavender mixed with something metallic lingered in the air, adding to the growing sense of dread. Eventually, I stumbled upon a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, revealing a room lined with bookshelves that towered to the ceiling. The library was vast, its air thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. The dim light from a single chandelier cast flickering shadows across the room, making the space feel alive. One book immediately caught my eye. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and the faded title embossed on its spine read, "Echoes of the Forgotten." As I opened it, I was greeted by hand-drawn illustrations of the house. Each page was more unsettling than the last. One drawing depicted the parlor, the grand piano at its center, surrounded by swirling shadows. Another showed the locked door at the end of the hallway, its frame glowing faintly. The final page stopped me cold. It was a sketch of Margaret, seated in a chair with a red rose in her hands. Beneath the drawing, a single sentence was written in jagged handwriting. She never left. The door at the end of the second-floor hallway had become an obsession. Its dark wood and the inscription above it, "Let the Forgotten Rest," seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. This time, when I reached for the handle, it turned easily. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The air that wafted up was icy, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Gripping the banister tightly, I descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. At the bottom of the staircase was a circular room. Its stone walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, faded photographs, and trinkets that seemed impossibly old. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay Margaret's journal. Beside the journal was a red rose, its petals unnaturally vibrant, glowing faintly in the dim light. I hesitated before picking up the journal, my fingers trembling as I touched its worn leather cover. Opening it, I found page after page filled with Margaret's frantic handwriting. Her entries grew more desperate with each page. The house whispers, it tempts, it takes, it knows our fears, our regrets, and it uses them against us. I hear him at night, but I know it's not him. It's the house. Please, if you find this, leave before it's too late. As I closed the journal, the air in the room grew heavier. The faint whispers that had filled the space now converged into a single chilling voice. "You shouldn't have come." I turned, and there she was, Margaret. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and her face, once delicate, was now twisted with pain and anger. "Margaret," I whispered, holding up the journal. "What happened to you?" "The house," she replied, stepping closer. "It takes everything. It feeds on fear, on sorrow, and now it wants you." The shadows in the room began to shift and writhe, twisting into shapes that reached out toward me. Their cold tendrils wrapped around my arms and legs, pulling me toward the darkness. Margaret's voice broke through the chaos. "Run!" she shouted, her voice filled with desperation. "You can still escape." Summoning every ounce of strength, I tore free from the shadows and bolted up the stairs. The house roared around me, its walls groaning and the floor trembling beneath my feet. When I reached the front door, it refused to open. I pounded against it, screaming, until finally it burst open, and I stumbled out into the freezing night air. The house loomed behind me, silent once more, but I could feel its presence watching me as I ran. Even now, years later, the memories of that house haunt me. The scars on my arms, where the shadows gripped me, remain a constant reminder of what I endured. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of a piano playing in the distance, and I wonder if Margaret is still there, trapped within the house, or if she has become part of it. If this story left you with chills, it's only the beginning. Like this story, and share it with friends who love the thrill of the unknown. Comment below. What would you do if you found yourself in this house? Subscribe to Nightmare Narratives for more haunting tales, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. Because some stories never truly end, they only wait.